I'm going to start out telling the story of Apple because it's got a lot of stories in it of creativity and where the sparks of creativity and the freedom to think and be entrepreneur-like come from, and then I'm going to talk about that at the end. It was kind of interesting growing up in Silicon Valley. I mean, this is the place that now, it's sort of the heartland of silicon transistors and integrated circuits, and so many electronic companies. So when I was very young, 9 years old, I would build my own ham radio. You'd buy parts of it. They would come as kits. You'd get hundreds of parts. You'd build the tube sockets and put in vacuum tubes and wire it up, and everything was running on tubes, including our televisions and radios in those days. And around that time, I was inspired by books and television. I want to be an engineer. I want to be one of those guys that goes into the laboratory and builds things, that saves the world from menacing forces. And those were the sort of things that I read. And I'd read a book about ham radio operators being able to send signals out to another state, another country. And I thought, wow, that's like Superman, if you can reach far away. And so that's why I became one at a very young age. And I started building projects, with switches and lights and dozens of relays for school projects. We had things called science fairs, and it was sort of a competition. And I would build these huge projects for such a young age. And I stumbled onto transistors. And I asked my dad, well, transistors, they could make decisions. I had found a journal in the hallway closet. My dad was an electrical engineer, and this journal described ones and zeros and computer logic and little gates and things that made decisions. And I thought, wow, so you could actually play tic-tac-toe. And I made a set of rules as to which squares to take and never lose tic-tac-toe. And for every rule, a little circuit with one transistor worked. Now, my dad never tried to impress values on us and say, you should be an engineer, you should study these things, you should go to this kind of school, you should be good in math. Never. But if we as children had a direction that we wanted to go, he would help us get there and pull out a blackboard and teach us some teaching at home. So I was very lucky for that his values weren't impressed on me, but I admired him so much and decided to become an engineer at an early age. I told him my second choice in life was to be a teacher of 10-year-olds, of fifth graders, because the teachers had been so important. Then he had influenced me that education was such a strong value in life. We had transistor radios back in 1960, and little tiny radio, you could go to sleep and hear music all night long. This was the most wonderful device in the world, and you could hold it in your hand. 20 years later, we were going to have the Walkman, and 20 years after that, we were going to have the iPod, little music players you could hold in your hand. But as I went through school, I started building large projects that were like computers, hundreds of transistors, nailed into pieces of wood or mounted on little circuit board materials and entering them and winning awards in contests. And I fell in love with this whole idea of what is a computer? Didn't know what a computer was, and I was so shy, I could never ask, I could never go look for books, but I kept searching for little clues as to what is a computer, what makes them work, why are they talked about so specially? Back in those days, you never expected to see a real computer. They were in, they took up rooms, and the military had them, and some weird places called research had these things called computers, but you'd never really likely see one. Even when I was going to be an engineer someday in my life, I expected I would build televisions and radios and guidance systems and the things that engineers do, and they don't work on computers after all. But I loved these machines, and I started playing around, learning these little logic circuits and building my projects out of them. In high school, my electronics teacher said, well, Steve, you know all the electronics in here, so it's worthless trying to teach you. And he arranged something very good for a teacher to do, to go beyond the school boundaries and find education that's outside of school. He arranged every year for some of the students to go to industry, to businesses. And I got to go down to a company and program a computer. This is back before we would have computers in our schools, but I learned how to write programs and punch them onto cards and put them into the machine and get the output. And one of the first programs I wrote was a knight's tour, a chess problem of bouncing a knight around the chessboard and hitting every single square exactly once. It's a well-known problem. It has solutions. And I thought, wow, I'm using a computer that can do 1 million things a second. How fast can a human being count numbers? Maybe one a second. A computer can do 1 million in 1 second. How powerful that is. And I wrote my program to bounce a knight around the chessboard, and when he got stuck and trapped, back up and try a different route, and back up and try a different route. He'll find the solution. And it didn't solve. And finally, after a couple of weeks, I went through and did a calculation. It wasn't going to come up with a solution for 10 to the 25th years.